Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Clinical Trials, Patient Safety, and Risk Reduction. This webinar is a part of an ongoing risk management and patient safety series in a partnership with XL Catlin. This is Jenna Pichet, Director of Communications with the Sullivan Group, and today's webinar moderator. Before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, if you need any technical assistance, please feel free to chat directly to the organizers or email me. You'll see my email address here. We are always looking for new ideas that are interesting and can be helpful to you all. So if you have ideas or requests for future webinar topics, we'd love to hear them. Feel free to email those my way as well. And finally, we will have a Q&A following today's presentation, but you don't need to wait to enter your questions. Feel free to enter them into the questions or chat box at any time during today's webinar, and we will have our presenter field those at the end of the presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Dan Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan is President and CEO of the Sullivan Group, a leader in risk management, patient safety, and quality improvement solutions for healthcare providers. Dr. Sullivan is a board-certified emergency medicine physician and a fellow in the American College of Emergency Physicians. He's also an attorney. The Sullivan Group creates scalable risk and safety solutions to some of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States. Our solutions touch tens of millions of patient visits annually and have been demonstrated to improve quality, patient safety, and outcomes in multiple patient settings. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Sullivan for today's presentation. Dr. Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenna, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on clinical trials, patient safety, and risk reduction. I think that I know I find this a fascinating subject area, and I think that that you'll enjoy some insight into the world of clinical trials and some of the issues and opportunities there. I wanted to mention that this subject kind of first came to my attention maybe a year ago. The folks at XL Catlin had spoken with me about presenting this issue as a part of a forum at their very first ever Bermuda Healthcare Forum. And so, as you know, many of you know, I'm familiar with some folks I know who are signed up for the webinar, and for those of you who don't, I've been deeply involved not only in the practice of emergency medicine for many years, but looking at the sources of patient injury, medical error, and adverse outcomes. And so I did a deep dive into clinical trials, and following XL Catlin's request, really the first time I had done that. And I just found it fascinating, and I think found some of the common denominators and want to share some of that, any opportunities to improve with you this morning or afternoon. Learning objectives for this presentation: provide an overview of the magnitude of the clinical trials complex. Now, complex might not be a term you've heard of before related to clinical trials, and that's probably because I just made it up. When I was looking at the magnitude of the research community, the only thing that came to mind was this is a huge complex of clinical trials, and we'll revisit that in a couple of minutes. We're going to use just a couple of actual cases. Now, I have reviewed lots of cases of clinical trials, problems, media, litigation, but I'm just going to use a couple that I think highlight the underlying issues that result in patient injury and resulting litigation, and then go through some recommendations for improving the delivery of clinical trials with a focus on keeping patients safe and risk reduction. And just a quick overview before we jump in. When the XL Catlin folks made that request, my initial thought was, well, it's about patient safety. Prior to that, we really spent a lot of time on medical errors and adverse outcomes. But my thought was, well, if patients are being injured in clinical research, there are problems related to the process. And so this is really right on mission for the Sullivan Group, and very happy to have done that and very happy to be doing it again with you. And as I looked at the cases, close scrutiny reveals that there are fundamental flaws in the research community's ability to deliver, to carry out its mission. And that leads to patient injury and an increase in federal and legal scrutiny, and obviously in litigation. So let's start with the Gallinger case. This case is some years old now, but as I went through it, I found that it really represents the most common shortfalls in clinical trials. And so since it had most of them in it, I thought this was a great place to start. And so take this not as what happened in this particular case necessarily, but how it represents the problems in the clinical trial process. And so I'll go through the facts here, and then we'll hit those common areas of problem. So Jesse Gallinger is an 18-year-old male, suffered from a metabolic disorder called OTC. I'll say it. You won't remember it, and even I have a hard time saying it. It's an ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency. It's an enzyme. He was able to control it. His case was not severe, so he was able to control it with low protein diet and drugs. So he was doing okay. This enzyme deficiency, it's genetic, and it results in a failure to break down ammonia. You can't live with a lot of ammonia in your body. It needs to be broken down, and it needs to be eliminated. And if you can't do that, then it leads to neurologic problems, including coma and death in serious cases. So the case was not litigated, it was settled. So I don't have all the depositions, I don't have the litigation transcripts, but from what I know about the case, although his case of OTC was not severe, he participated in the clinical trial knowing the study would not benefit him, but he thought there was little risk and that it might be benefit to those yet to be born with OTC. Okay, well, there's a huge issue right there. All right? He thought as he entered the trial there was little risk and that it might benefit others. Okay, the issue is little risk. He didn't get adequate informed consent. If he had, he would have known there was more than a little risk. So he was infused. He agreed, and he was infused with trillions of particles of an adenovirus vector, each carrying DNA that would produce the OTC protein. So I want to jump into that just a little bit more because we're talking about one of the major issues in this presentation and in problems related to clinical trials is informed consent. So what this is an adenovirus. It's a virus, and they use it as a vector, which means that they take the virus and they inject in each one strands of DNA that are the producers of this enzyme. So they fill the virus full of it, and then they inject the virus. So it's a vector, it delivers. They inject the virus into the body. Okay, now imagine you're a principal investigator, you've delegated the responsibility for informed consent to a tech, or to a nurse who's not part of the clinical team. And imagine explaining this to a patient. Now that virus is going to infect all the cells of your body. Once it gets inside the cell of your body, the cell will attack it, it'll kill the virus, it'll open up, the DNA will spread all over, and hopefully it will merge with your genome. That then will start creating the enzyme, and that will help your clinical condition. Right? I mean, think about that. That is complex stuff. That is a difficult explanation. It turns out that this viral vector was a new gene delivery mechanism, and in fact turned out to be more toxic than other vectors used in gene transfer. And within days of the injection, unfortunately, Mr. Gallinger suffered from liver toxicity, a blood clotting disorder, kidney failure, lung failure, and finally brain death. Okay, problems. There was a massive conflict of interest in this case. And again, it's not so much about this case as how it is meant to be educational for those who are creating, originating, conducting, and delivering clinical trial research. Principal investigator is Dr. Wilson. He conducted at the Institute, this was conducted at the Institute for Human Gene Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania. So Dr. Wilson was a founder and 30% owner of the Genovo company, which was the source of the trial medication. So as Genova succeeded, so Dr. Wilson succeeded. Financially or in other ways. An obvious conflict of interest. He was an employee of UPenn. He was an employee of Genovo. Certainly the appearance of a conflict, and he ran the institute. And Genovo gave millions of dollars to the institute. And so, the web of conflict here is rather dramatic, and so a good example, but you can imagine, there's many instances where it's not so apparent, where the conflict isn't so obvious, and each of those needs to be evaluated and investigated by the IRB, or Institutional Review Board. Another one, UPenn, Dr. Wilson, Genovo. This adenovirus vector was a new delivery mechanism. They would have been able to patent it, and all would have benefited from that. So lots of issues here in conflict of interest. Okay, again, I mentioned that this case serves, as a marker for issues. For the major issues where we find issues, problems, patient injury, the IRB process. The UPenn Institutional Review Board approved the study. UPenn has a conflict of interest committee, and they thought that a conflict may exist, but the university allowed the trial to proceed. Again, I want to stop because it's one thing to hear the facts of the case, but I want people who are viewing and listening to really understand. Given that conflict of interest from the last slide, how did this conflict of interest committee say it's okay, go ahead and proceed? Imagine what was happening in that room. Either they didn't have all the facts, or they were under significant political, financial pressure to let something like this go. These trials involve millions of dollars, and there was a significant financial relationship between Genovo and the institute, if not UPenn. And this is common. This exists in many academic facilities, and it's not like you can say, hey, don't have these relationships. You can say, oh, don't, get rid of the political pressures. But these things exist. It's the reality, and just something that we need to understand, learn, and educate about. And then this last bullet point. So either the IRB approved an inadequate informed consent process initially. So the IRB process is one of these key issues in analysis of all these cases. So the initial informed consent was a problem, or there was not ongoing monitoring of the trial to continuously evaluate risk and benefit and modify the informed consent. Inadequate informed consent. Okay, next huge issue, and another common denominator in all the cases, in many of the cases that I've looked at. Patients were shown an informed consent document that did not adequately inform regarding the process and the risks of the adenovirus vector injection. What were some of those issues? Well, the patients, the study subject, should have known there was a conflict of interest. The informed consent was modified to remove the death of test animals who were injected with the virus. No mention was made of prior patients who had had serious adverse effects. That should have been part of at least a modified informed consent process, and that was not done. Violation of federal guidelines. Another part of many cases, especially in this highly regulated genetic genome research area. The FDA Genetic Recombination Committee was not informed of a change in the method of viral administration. Investigators did not report that prior patients suffered from liver toxicity and that the study should have been put on hold, and there were failure to follow study protocol. So federal guidelines. Researchers, IRBs, need to be familiar with those guidelines, academic facilities. So failure to follow the study protocol. There's another one. Another key, critical, important area as I look at these cases is, if you got a protocol, you need to follow it to the letter. Did not follow study protocol. Supposed to treat 2 women before treating a male, Mr. Gallinger. Study violation. Mr. Gallinger had elevated liver enzymes. Incredible. This had been demonstrated to be liver toxic. He had elevated liver enzymes, which meant that he already had a problem with his liver, should not have been injected. So in some of these areas, now that conflict with Dr. Wilson was apparent. And I think, the reasonable person would have recognized it and should have done something about it. Informed consent wasn't good enough. But sometimes conflicts are really subtle. They're nuances. Problems in the provision of informed consent, they can be subtle. No one is intentionally not giving information to patients, for the most part. But if you've got a study protocol, you just follow that study protocol. Deviations are inexcusable. But it speaks to education and coordination of the team. And medical errors are common. You see CCs instead of ML, and you think CC is 0, 0. So too much medication is given, or you don't see labs. They're not delivered appropriately, to your computer. You can see why errors would occur, but there are opportunities for improvement here. But you have to stick with the study protocol, period. The legal theories that were suggested in this case, wrongful death, negligence, failure to provide informed consent, product liability, without the appropriate informed consent, allegations of assault and battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Pretty common, and there are others, and I'll mention those in a couple of minutes. In the aftermath, there was an independent panel of experts that concluded that the UPenn Institute was not capable of complying with federal regulations governing clinical trials, and the FDA stopped all human clinical trials at the Institute. Well, this is huge. It's a major financial blow to an institution that depends upon funding research. As important, what impact did this have on the community that was reading about this happening at UPenn, and of course, the impact that it has on human lives, just critically important. As a result of this case, the American Society of Gene Therapy said, all investigators and team members directly responsible for patient selection, the informed consent process, and or clinical management in a trial must not have equity, stock options, or comparable arrangements in companies sponsoring the trial. So this is a big case. It was an important case, and folks responded to what happened in this case. And we know, again, as an aside, it's difficult not having a conflict. You're a researcher. You've discovered something interesting and new. You've discovered an adenovirus vector. This could have been the best thing ever. This could have been huge, if it had worked, if it had all been done right. Obviously, there's an interest. You probably have something to do with the company who is creating it for you. So it's difficult to be divorced and completely abandon anything to do with the subject of the research. And so there are difficulties. This is a tough area to do everything right. And I wanted to focus on that for a couple of minutes now and talk about the challenge, the magnitude of the research challenge. When folks from XL Caitlin and I were working on this, I got on the internet, clinicaltrials.gov. You can look it up right now. You can find out how many active clinical trials there are happening right now, how many there have been historically, and you can put in study and search terms. It's really a cool site. And when we were working on this together for the presentation, there are 45,000 active clinical studies in the United States, active clinical trials, 45,000. And the rate with which trials are increasing is pretty dramatic. Now, so let's do a little bit of math here. And here's clinical trials complex again. I told you we'd be coming back to this, and maybe I didn't make it up, and you can tell me that in the Q&A later. But I couldn't think of a better term. Maybe you can. It's the size of the research community. So IRBs are required to register with the Department of Health and Human Services, and they have 300 registrations a month. 45,000 open U.S. clinical trials. So 45,000, and they need a principal investigator for, so 45,000. Maybe some of them double up. Maybe there's 40,000 principal investigators. 40,000 principal investigators. Now, every clinical trial is different. You don't know who's on their research team. Some have a lot, some have a few. You can just call it 10. 450,000 people on the research team. It's a lot of people. Advanced practitioners, nurses, techs, and they're working with some people who aren't even on the research team. And that last bullet point, hundreds of thousands of patients enrolled, is probably millions. It's just, I don't know, and nobody does. Probably millions of people that are involved in 45,000 clinical trials. So in every trial, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, they have to get it right. They have to carefully scrutinize to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. They need to understand. They need enough education and understanding in clinical trials to know that there's enough benefit here to take the risk. They need to work with the researchers to create an informed consent forum that really provides informed consent. So they have to get it right. The principal investigator has to get it right. And he or she has to deliver it to an entire research team that have to get it right. And they need to keep it right, because clinical trials research is dynamic. It's not like, okay, we got it, here's the protocol, let's go. Things change over time. You learn things. Some research has to be stopped because people are being hurt. Some trials are stopped because they're so good, it's ridiculous to randomize people into an arm that gets placebo. So the whole team has to get it right. What does that mean? That means that in reality, there isn't a conflict of interest. It means that the risk-benefit is appropriate. It means informed consent truly delivers the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. It means that the protocol is followed to the letter. It means changes are made when something occurs in the research to change the facts when appropriate, and changes are communicated back up to the principal investigator, back up to the IRB, and change in patient condition is monitored and responded to. There are millions of patients, right? And every one of them, some of them obviously aren't going to have an impact on a patient's condition. Many of them are going to have a huge impact on patient's condition. And in those studies, that patient conditions must be monitored and responded to. But there's a fundamental flaw. And I looked at the folks who are going to be on this call, and you're not delivering the clinical trial for the most part. Maybe some of you are, but for the most part, when I look who's going to potentially be listening to this presentation, you're not the one at the bedside. You're not the ones drawing the blood. Okay, that's a different team. That's the clinical team, and I'm one of those people. Right? And I can tell you that we have no medical school training in the broad range of logistics required to run a clinical trial. I don't remember hearing anything about it. My daughter is a recently graduated emergency physician. I'm shocked, but she never heard anything about clinical trials in medical school. Okay, this is a group that delegates responsibility. Okay, we're delegators. And sometimes it gets delegated to people who may not understand the key issues. If this went from Dr. Wilson to an advanced practitioner who was working with a couple of techs, I don't think they're going to adequately convey what an adenovirus vector is. We have not been schooled in conflict of interest. If it's obvious, like, I own Genovo and I'm, and if this works at my institution, I'm getting rich. But many of these conflicts are subtle, and more on that in just a minute. And then another key issue, we're just not known for our communication skills. Now, I hope you feel like I'm communicating adequately in this presentation, or we'll all be very disappointed. But I've been working on doing these sorts of things for many, many years. But we're not trained in this in school, and you know practitioners. Even if there's practitioners on the call, you're not going to disagree. Communication skills is not what we're all about. But these must be present. Right? These need to be there, if we're going to properly run a clinical trial. On this issue of conflicts and subtleties, right, there's a significant, if not dramatic, increase in the number of trials funded by for-profit organizations. And as a result, JAMA and others were looking into, is this impacting research? And this is excuse me, this is an older article, but conclusions in trials funded by for-profit organizations may be more positive due to biased interpretation of trial results, and readers should carefully evaluate. And if you pull that article, you'll read, these were carefully juried. These were carefully evaluated. These were with IRB oversight. So sometimes these conflicts are built in, and it's difficult to avoid. problems in conflict. For-profit company research is 5.3 times more likely to show favorable benefit for the product compared with a nonprofit. Hey, that's really a critical number. Okay, readers need to truly evaluate. Problem with that is most readers don't really get the statistics. A complicated meta-analysis is some heavy stuff. Most practitioners truly don't understand that. In the American Journal of Psychiatry a couple of years later, author conflict of interest appears to be prevalent among psychiatric clinical trials and to be associated with a greater likelihood of reporting a drug to be superior to a placebo. So conflict is there. Conflict is it's in the research web, and most of these cases are not like the Gallinger cases. Most of them are far more subtle. And of course, the federal regs and academic institutions, they've become much more schooled in this, and so they're being much more careful. And yet, the bias may still exist. So a quick fact check. I'm trying to be really current here, right? Research community fact check. Right? The research community is enormous. There has been a dramatic growth in the number of clinical trials, many of which are now sponsored by for-profit organizations. Conflict is built in, often built in, sometimes without an actual awareness that it's there. IRBs are overworked, often undereducated, and they are under pressure to approve from many directions. The outcome? Many healthcare practitioners are ill-prepared for the complexities involved in properly delivering a clinical trial protocol. Again, many healthcare practitioners are ill-prepared for the complexities involved in properly delivering a clinical trial protocol. Hey, it's easier taking care of an acute myocardial infarction. It is easier to identify and take care of appendicitis. It is. This is complex. There are so many moving parts. In informed consent, if I'm taking care of a dislocated shoulder, you dislocate your shoulder, I'm talking to you, I've got a couple things to tell you. I'm going to give you some medication. It's going to make you sedated. I'm going to fix your elbow. Here's how your shoulder. Here's how I'm going to do it. And I use this medicine so when you wake up, you'll have amnesia and you're not even going to know I did it. All right? That's really different than a new chemotherapeutic agent. That's really different than adenovirus vector that impacts the genome. Okay? There are complexities. In the best of situations, there are numerous roads to error. And importantly, for the most part, these issues are not intentional. These are dedicated people who want to make the world a better place with clinical trials. And so there are mistakes, medical errors. How many medical errors happen in the United States every day? Well, errors occur in clinical trials as well. And we just need to get educated, understand. We need to let people know what those errors are so it can be front of mind. We need to do a little human factors engineering to help with the delivery of the research protocol. And like MedMal, there are far more errors than there are lawsuits. Lawsuits are good markers. They help us with certain fact situations. Most errors are, hopefully are not harmful, but many occur in the daily process of delivering clinical trials. And on this case review, I think it should give us focus. Issues are fundamentally related to IRB oversight, conflict of interest, adherence to protocol, and informed consent. Although there are other allegations, that's what it's about for the most part. That's resulted in increasing federal oversight and, of course, an emerging field of clinical trial liability. And again, in general, what you see when you look at these cases are allegations of wrongful death, negligence, informed consent, assault and battery, infliction of emotional distress, and then other elements that don't actually have a cause of action around them, not respecting the dignity of the individual. Ethics reports, the Belmont Report and the Nuremberg Code, are often mentioned in the allegations of wrongdoing. I wanted to visit one other trial and just kind of look at a different aspect of it, and then we'll finish up the presentation. But this is a device trial. Dr. Nagel was the principal investigator in a case involving the Sika system to control fecal incontinence. It involved the delivery of radio frequency energy to the muscles of the anal canal to improve its barrier function by causing the formation of scar tissue. Ms. Gukin, had mild fetal incontinence. She didn't have to wear a diaper, and she could always get to a bathroom. Again, mild. Now, next fact, really important. She agreed to the procedure after she was told that a prior trial of 10 people proved its success. That the procedure was her best alternative, and that even if it didn't work, she'd be no worse off. Okay, so you have that discussion with a patient. That's part of your informed consent discussion. We proved it with 10 people. You don't prove something with 10 people. In 99.9% of clinical trials, you don't prove anything with 10 people. You don't say, this is your best alternative. You say, there are alternatives. And, to say that even if it doesn't work, you'll be no worse off is just, right? Whoever said this, okay, they weren't on the team. They hadn't been educated. She got $300 for participating, and it was actually a registered nurse who did the informed consent. Did not mention, interesting, she didn't mention the word experiment or clinical trial. Did not review the risk benefits and the alternative. So the unfortunate facts are the device used to target the sphincter muscle malfunctioned and failed to shut off automatically when it reached a dangerous temperature. And Mrs. Gukin's sphincter muscle was almost completely destroyed. She was left with no control over her bowel movements, and she was in need of subsequent surgery to remove damaged tissue. Now, as those of you who are aware of the litigation process, you know that certain things are just so inflammatory that you could not defend the case. And no one told Ms. Gukin about this problem, about this malfunction, until several days later, I think a couple of weeks, when she needed a subsequent surgery. After the surgery, her doctor told her you had to have the surgery because there was a malfunction. It's just unbelievable. You can't make this kind of thing up. Those are bad facts. It's very inflammatory. It would be hard to take such a case to court. What's interesting here is they went after the IRB. The complaint named individual members of the IRB, and the allegations included negligence. You didn't protect your clinical trial subjects. You were negligent in approving the design of the study, in not monitoring the informed consent process, in not monitoring the conduct of the trial. The patient never got informed consent from Dr. Nagel. And my thought here is, this delegation issue. Well, how many patients were in this? Who gave the informed consent? Should have been Dr. Nagel, or a very trusted member of that team. The document did not even have the word experiment or clinical trial, only the word study, and it didn't have a section where it set forth the risk benefits and alternatives. The bottom line was the patient did not understand the document. Allegations, no surprise, failure to treat in accord with the standards governing medical and research professions, failed to conduct the trial in a careful and professional manner, failed to follow government regulations governing the conduct of trials, and of course the failure to provide informed consent. So let's finish up with some golden rules, if you will, about the conduct of clinical trials. I found a very nice article on human experimentation. I took some license. I modified these rules a little bit. So let's take a look. For IRB members, must understand roles, risks, and responsibilities. Avoid even the appearance of a conflict. Truly analyze and perform a careful risk-benefit analysis for each trial. Approve only informed consent documents that truly convey the risk, benefits, and alternatives. And really importantly, see evidence that there's a process for appropriate delivery of that informed consent. Deliver clear guidelines for when investigators must return to the IRB for ongoing oversight and modification. And if you're a participant in research, you have to make sure that this has been approved by an appropriate IRB. You've got to make sure that you're covered for problems that may occur. Consult an attorney or insurance carrier to determine if you're covered for the clinical trial. Employ qualified and certified clinical trial coordinators to help administer the trials. Ensure that the participants are fully and properly informed. Ensure that alternative treatments is a section in the informed consent document, and it's clear and it's complete. Only participate in studies where the providers and their practices have got the expertise and resources to understand and conduct to deliver that clinical trial. Refuse to accept studies where you believe that risk to the participant outweighs the benefits. You may be asked to participate because someone up the chain thought that the benefit outweighed the risk. You may not believe that. Question that. Ask questions about it. Go back up and sit with the committee, talk about it. And then obviously you've got a protocol. Adhere scrupulously to the inclusion-exclusion criteria and the study protocol. Excuse me. So to conclude, the clinical trials complex is immense. Management and oversight to keep patients safe and reduce risk is a daunting task. I hope you've gotten that from this presentation. There are so many moving parts. It involves so many people in the delivery of the trial. There are so many patients whose conditions are all unique. Truly a daunting task. And the problems are not intentional for the most part. They're simply intrinsic to the complexities of the system. Under the best of circumstances, and in many cases by design, this is clinical research, right? Many of these people have significant problems, and then are randomized. Some get a trial drug, some don't. There's risk. Patients are at risk. The reality is that many members of the medical profession are not trained to conduct appropriate, safe, well-organized clinical trials. They have to be educated in order to conduct these clinical trials. Following patient injury, careful scrutiny, again, that's me looking at lots and lots of cases. These issues relate to IRB process and oversight, conflict of interest, the informed consent document or process, adherence to protocol, failure to return to the IRB as required. And finally, solutions are needed. What is it? Online education. There will be a link from this presentation that will be available. The Sullivan Group is coordinating an online program in our learning management system that will be available. Some of these things should be built into the electronic health record. Protocol assistance, inclusion and exclusion assistance, human factors engineering. We need help. This is complex. The typical today's biggest market seller EHRs don't do this. But we should have this in our sites for the future. Informed consent training, videos, right way, wrong way. Clearly, this is an area of opportunity to keep patients safe and avoid exposure to liability. And as part of our mission, we do presentations like this because we would like to see that happen, and we believe that it can. So thank you very much for taking the time. I hope you found that interesting. I hope that gets your wheels turning, and and together as a team, perhaps we can better deliver the message around clinical trials, keep our patients safe and reduce risk. Thank you, and Jenna, I'll turn it over to you for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sullivan. Very interesting presentation about this complex world, so thanks for breaking it down. We do have a couple questions that have come in. Before we address those, again, just a reminder, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat or the questions box, and we'll address those for you. If we don't have enough time today, we will follow up and answer your questions individually. So Dr. Sullivan, our first question is, how do we deliver this message to clinical trial teams in our client organizations?
Well, we talked about that a little bit, and as I said, as I was looking at who was participating in today's presentation, I noticed that for the most part, you are the folks who hospitals and organizations are coming to, and they're saying we need to deal with this risk. We need to deal with this problem, or you are the end of the chain, the folks who fund when there is an adverse outcome. And I think that there is a place for when you have discussions with your clients that one of the check boxes ought to be for the appropriate institutions. Where I was chairman of the emergency department south of Chicago, we didn't have much of this going on. On the other hand, we were right next to Rush and University of Chicago and University of Illinois. So, if those are your clients, I think there's a checkbox that says, how are you delivering education around clinical trials? How do we know that your IRB is organized, educated, has got it together, has the time, isn't feeling the political pressure, isn't feeling any financial pressure? How do we know who's delivering informed consent? Who on the team? And I think you sort of you get to wag the research community because of your place in the market. And I think that's an important function. And so when you sort of raise that level of awareness, they might look at you and say, what are you talking about? And I think internally they'll appreciate it, and they'll begin to put together something so there is an increased understanding, or you're sharing this WebEx, or you're getting onto an online course. And so you've got a group of 40 people in a very risky clinical trial. I think they need to be current in their understanding of all the complexities that we've just talked about today.
Great, thank you. A second question, what advice would you give to physician med-mal insurers who have doctors participating in IRBs? For example, what underwriting questions should be asked?
Good question. I think they're on the slides here. I think it's a stopping point in any education, in any discussion about underwriting. We had insurance companies. We developed them. We were part of them. And we never asked. No one ever asked me. I think it's describe your IRB process and who's on it, and what's the oversight, and how are you monitoring for changes in clinical condition. I don't know that you need to get too deeply into the weeds. I think it's an open-ended question about how are you dealing with the complexities of delivering clinical trials. What are the steps that you take to make sure that your next patient truly understands what this is all about and can opt in and can opt out? Who's telling them that? Who are your principal investigators? What are you doing about conflict of interest? I think that should be part of the discussion. I think it should be part of the discussion. Be happy to talk to you about it, and if there's somebody on the call who's in that position, but something along those lines, I think should be happening.
Thank you. Another question. You indicated that for-profit research is skewed towards favorable benefits. So there's a multi-part question here. What are your thoughts about patient-funded clinical trials? And do you feel they're at greater risk than nonprofit and for-profit company trials? And how prevalent are those patient trials?
Well, I don't know the answer to much of this. I indicated that the for-profit trials appear to be skewed, and that's not Dan's interpretation. That's what the research indicates, that somehow it gets built in. And patient-funded, honestly, I don't know. I haven't seen much about them. I haven't read much about them. I haven't seen a case of proposed litigation or litigation that involves such things. So I simply don't know enough about them to speak with any expertise about them.
All right, next question. As a former practitioner yourself, what's your experience in prescribing a new drug to patients? And how do you balance the value, safety, efficacy versus the questions?
Well, first of all, I was trusting, that the committee in charge of new drugs in the formulary did an adequate analysis of the new drug, and certainly if it was an off-label or it was non-FDA approved, it makes you nervous. It makes you nervous. When lytics first came out, they were being used. The research was strong, but not FDA approved. And then movement into stroke and administration of lytics. It gives one pause. But you see someone with a dense hemiplegia, and you think, geez, I don't know, will people actually reverse? And sometimes you go ahead with it. But that was certainly not part of a clinical trial. It was just a new drug that didn't have FDA approval, and a completely different subject than being inside a clinical trial, where we've all bought on to benefit outweighs the risk, and we are going to give this, and we think we're going to make the world a better place with it. So, kind of two separate tracks there. A new drug. Every hospital's got its pharmacy committee. We from the emergency department made sure that we had someone sitting on that committee, and so when those new drugs came to the emergency department, our clinical staff had been part of the discussion of bringing it into the emergency department formulary. I hope that addresses that issue for you.
Thank you. A follow-up question. What about the risk that is borne by providers participating in IRBs that can be held fiscally responsible for sidelining a clinical trial?
For sidelining a clinical trial. So all is well. All has been reviewed by the IRB, but there's holdout won't agree because he or she believes that that there is the risk-benefit equation doesn't work, or some part of the process is inadequate. And so the question is, there are lawsuits that result. All right, I haven't seen them. Whoever asked that question, if you know about them, I'd be happy to have you jump on here and talk about them. I can only run through what happens from the experience, the many lawsuits I've looked at, and I've not seen one that results from someone who derailed a clinical trial in an IRB. Sounds like a great question, and if I can follow up with the person who's asking, if I can get a couple of fact patterns, I'd be happy to put that in our next newsletter.
Hi, Dan. This is Bruce Whitmore with Willis Towers Watson.
Hey, Bruce?
How are you?
Was that you?
Yes.
Good. Tell us.
We have a section within our organization that specializes in, kind of the fiscal exposure to whether it be universities, other folks who are conducting these clinical trials, especially by, on behalf of for-profit, big pharma, if you will. They're particularly concerned about, what happens if either there's a mistake in the performance of the clinical trial, data in the error collecting, data submission, whatever it may be, and then by so doing it delays the launch of what could have been a highly profitable drug for that pharmaceutical company. And as a result, the pharmaceutical company brings action against, against the people who are performing the trial. And the numbers are big.
I'll bet they are. And Bruce, have you got fact patterns? I mean, has this made it through, to juries in various jurisdictions? Have you got fact patterns? Let's get a couple.
I will say the answer is yes, but we actually have specialists. It's actually beyond what I do on a day-to-day basis. But the answer is yes.
I'd love to follow up on that with you, Bruce, and appreciate your comments.
Sure.
Thanks, and thanks for stepping in there, Bruce, to clarify. Final question for today, and then we'll wrap it up. Dr. Sullivan, what can academic organizations do to ensure that they achieve compliance in those areas that may result in patient injury?
Well, I know that there are organizations out there that really have got it together, right? Just top notch. They've really looked carefully at the IRB process. Who's on it, oversight, maybe there's a conflict of interest committee, there's an ethics committee, they're evaluating folks who are doing informed consent. They're looking carefully at the informed consent documents. They're analyzing for conflict. But I am sure there are many out there who have not. And I think that, my eyes have been opened working with XL Caitlin. My eyes have been opened to this world of problems, complexities, adverse outcomes, and there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. And I think it's just looking internally. I think it is looking at the whole process from start to finish. It is creating an oversight, maybe a conflicts committee, going to the ethics committee maybe initially to make sure that the IRB is really on task. Watching that informed consent process. Who's performing the informed consent process? I think doing a checks and balances on the whole process. What happens when there was a change in patient condition? What happens when there was a necessary change in protocol? Was that delivered back up? Are there changes in protocol that are happening about the IRB, or maybe the federal government being involved, federal agencies being involved? I think much to do. Much opportunity, because I don't know what the pie graph would be of those who have it together and those who don't, but I think everyone could stand from sort of bootstrapping this process and getting a really close look, carefully analyzing what's happening in their organizations. The bottom line is it's good for everybody, right? It's good to find the next miracle drug or device. It's good for the community because it brings in research dollars, because it builds reputation. good for the patients because they get to live longer. So this is all good, but because it is complex, because it needs to be done right, there are lots of opportunities where injury and harm can occur. And so together, I think we'll work on taking opportunities to turn that around, and I think organizations can start there.
Wonderful. And with that, we have reached the end of our allotted time for today. So Dr. Sullivan, thank you so much for answering our questions. And again, we will make this video recording available and we'll get this emailed out within the week. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues and look for additional CME opportunities around this topic to be made available through the Sullivan Group in the future. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great day.